Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world where love letters were basically invoices, weddings were less about romance and more about political chess, and your happily ever after might literally depend on whether your parents liked your dowry or not. Picture a dusty, candlelit European village in the 1500s, where everyone smelled faintly of goat cheese, wet wool, and unwashed ambition. Knights strutted around like they invented posture, peasants hustled for scraps, and somewhere in the middle, someone's grandmother was whispering, "Marry well or cry forever." So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see if you're currently judging medieval marriage from a sunny beach or your sad little cubicle. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marriage in 1500s Europe was less of a meet cute at a cafe scenario and more of a strategic negotiation disguised as a social obligation where love might happen later, if at all, and sometimes that was considered a bonus rather than a requirement. Noble families treated marriages like corporate mergers, exchanging daughters for lands, titles, or an extra layer of protection against marauding neighbors, while peasants mostly married whoever didn't immediately cause a famine in their hearts or their stomachs. So low stakes, right? Brides often spent years being groomed, sometimes literally in preparation, taught the domestic arts, sewing, managing accounts, and smiling through a variety of mild inconveniences, which apparently included pretending to be thrilled by your father's generous financial arrangements. Husbands, on the other hand, were expected to look impressive on paper, swear loyalty to the crown or local lord, and, if possible, refrain from obvious alcoholism during the wedding, though that last one was a bit optimistic. Weddings themselves were extravaganzas that could bankrupt families for decades, because nothing says eternal commitment like borrowing heavily to throw a feast with live animals and an open keg that your distant cousins immediately overran. Dowries were often the centerpiece, as if the couple were a discount market item, and a bad dowry could condemn a bride to endless sighs and awkward side eyes from her in-laws. Church ceremonies were mandatory unless someone had a blackmail-worthy secret, and even then, the priest would probably just mumble louder in Latin to drown out the snickering. Love, if it existed, usually arrived post-wedding in the form of tolerance or mild respect, though occasionally sparks flew between two humans who hadn't been auctioned off for social leverage. Shocking, right? Peasant unions, while less about titles, had their own chaos, with mismatched ages, unexpected pregnancies, and village gossip that spread faster than the plague. So public reputation was constantly on probation. The gender dynamic was brutally practical. Women needed to produce heirs, men needed to consolidate wealth and labor, and anyone caught feeling too much could be gently reminded that feelings were expensive. Amid all this, a sense of humor was quietly mandatory, because surviving a marriage negotiation where your uncle tried to sell your younger sibling to the blacksmith required either crying or laughing, preferably both at once. From the outside, it looked messy, rigid, and occasionally hilarious, and internally, it was a complex game where your ability to dodge insults, keep a smile, and count your coins determined if you'd survive the first decade of wedlock without plotting murder or fleeing to a convent. Everyone learned early that marriage was a negotiation disguised as ritual, a gamble wrapped in gossip, and somehow, despite the sheer absurdity, life trudged forward, arranged marriages kept happening, and somewhere, a bride was eyeing the ceiling, wondering if she'd ever meet someone she actually liked. Once the contractual basics were set, The lead up to the wedding was a theatrical carnival of awkward rituals, family politics, and passive-aggressive tedium that made modern bridal showers look like low-stakes tea parties. Brides were often sequestered for weeks in what might as well have been emotional boot camps, where they were trained to curtsy on command, laugh at jokes that weren't funny, and nod solemnly while male relatives discussed the precise weight of coins in their dowry, because apparently enthusiasm was optional, but accounting accuracy was not. Grooms had their own rehearsals, mostly involving showing off swords or horses to impress distant relatives, while trying not to look like a man who'd spent too much time sniffing cheese in the pantry. Invitations were delivered by foot, horse, or carrier pigeon, depending on the family budget, and could take months to circulate, which meant that the anticipation was at a maximum, while everyone silently judged the bride's wardrobe, the groom's posture, and the family's taste in edible centerpieces. Parties were held in the interim, often doubling as mild public trials where the community assessed whether the couple might actually survive living in the same room for more than a fortnight without plotting clandestine escapes. The scent of roasting meats, spilled wine, and chalky floor dust, combined with the occasional faint whiff of despair from stressed mothers, creating a fragrance that today's perfumers would charge a fortune to replicate, but nobody wanted. Religious authorities loomed over the proceedings like unpaid interns with power complexes, ensuring that vows adhered to canon law and reminding everyone that divine wrath was pending for any error, because nothing says fun like a God-shaped threat hovering above your festive meals. Superstitions thrived. Breaking a mirror during the dress fitting meant 7 years of marital misery. Sneezing near the groom's boots could summon bad luck, and anyone caught sneezing at the wrong time might be publicly shamed because logic was optional but drama mandatory. Children were often drafted into roles, whether as page boys, flower bearers, or unsuspecting pawns in negotiating family alliances, which made them simultaneously adorable and traumatized. Basically, the medieval equivalent of forcing your kid to model at Fashion Week. Meanwhile, townsfolk gossiped openly, assigning roles of hero or villain based solely on who had the audacity to smile or frown at the wrong moment, and the resulting reputations sometimes stuck for decades. By the time the wedding day arrived, nerves were high, expectations were sky level, and the bride probably wondered if she'd been traded like livestock in a particularly dramatic episode of reality TV. Even the best laid plans were prone to chaos. Drunken uncles, stubborn horses, misfired fireworks, or a sudden rainstorm could turn the pomp and ritual into a slapstick disaster that someone would still write about in the village chronicles, complete with snarky footnotes. Despite all this, the spectacle mattered because the public affirmation of the union was considered essential. If no one saw it happen, did it even really count? Couples, families, and neighbors alike had no choice but to perform with grim enthusiasm, knowing that the next several decades, filled with children, chores, political maneuvering, and the occasional dramatic gossip, would hinge on these few chaotic, beautifully staged hours. Amid the chaos, humor, sharp wit, and a mild sense of nihilism were quietly acknowledged survival tools, even if nobody said so aloud. After the ceremony, the so-called honeymoon was, let's be honest, often less romantic retreat and more logistical trial by fire, because medieval Europe didn't exactly offer tropical resorts or couples massages, unless you counted sleeping in a drafty, vermin-friendly chamber as cozy ambiance. Newlyweds were expected to immediately begin the arduous business of proving the marriage's practical value, producing heirs, managing households, and not getting caught sulking while secretly regretting their life choices. In noble households, the pressure was dialed up to 11 as the couple's every move was scrutinized by watchful relatives, servants, and occasionally the local priest who had apparently nothing better to do than note who sat where at dinner. Physical intimacy, if it happened at all in the first few nights, was approached with a mix of anxiety, superstition, and awkward fumbling because sex ed consisted of whispered warnings about sin, disease, and procreation, and naturally, zero actual guidance. Failure to conceive quickly was considered not just unfortunate, but potentially scandalous, a literal threat to family lineage, political power, and the collective ego of distant cousins who never liked the bride anyway. Peasant couples faced a different kind of pressure. They were expected to merge labor, livestock management, and economic survival into a single living arrangement that often involved sharing one bed, one table, and, shockingly, one set of clothes in rotation, which naturally made private moments feel like a luxury. Humor, again, became a secret weapon. Laughing at the absurdity of having to heat a pot of gruel over a smoky fire while pretending the smoke wasn't choking, both partners helped preserve sanity. Seasonal chores dictated routines more than romantic inclinations. Planting, harvesting, tending to animals, and repairing roofs often took precedence over sentimental considerations, and failing to do so invited judgment sharper than any dagger, usually from your spouse. Dowries occasionally became a source of tension if goods were missing, miscounted, or mysteriously disappeared, which might lead to extended passive-aggressive stares across the kitchen table. Nobility's honeymoon sometimes involved short tours of family estates or retreats to secondary castles, which was basically medieval window shopping, while everyone quietly calculated which heir got which slice of property. Social observation was constant. Servants, neighbors, and visiting dignitaries were all jury, spectators, and critics rolled into one, meaning that every laugh, frown, or misstep could ripple through months of gossip and subtle manipulations. And yet, even amidst all this scrutiny, accidental camaraderie, genuine affection, and fleeting moments of shared joy did emerge, often surprisingly, like finding a wildflower in a pile of horse manure. Cultural expectations, religious mandates, and sheer survival instincts shaped the early married life, leaving little room for self-expression, but it also forced couples to learn negotiation, compromise, and sometimes the subtle art of ignoring a cousin's horrified glare when the soup boiled over. By the end of the first week, couples were officially tested, both emotionally and physically, and those who survived without full-blown mutiny had earned, if not love, at least grudging mutual respect. Because in the 1500s, respect was as close as you got to romance without someone fainting dramatically in the corner. The role of women in these marriages was a masterclass in social endurance and silent judgment, because being a wife in 1500s Europe meant simultaneously running a household, producing heirs, and subtly policing the moods of everyone from servants to in-laws, all while maintaining the illusion of unbothered perfection. Noble women were trained in everything from accounting to embroidery, and occasionally the subtle art of nodding along to conversations they had zero interest in, which, spoiler alert, was basically every conversation. They inherited a script of societal expectations so rigid that stepping out of line could result in anything from whispered gossip to outright exile from polite circles, depending on how dramatic Aunt Gertrude was feeling that week. Peasant women, meanwhile, weren't exactly living a carefree life either, laboring from dawn to dusk, managing animals, preparing food, and sometimes giving birth in the middle of all this created a rhythm that was exhausting yet oddly efficient, like life had pressed fast forward but refused to offer a pause button. Humor and sarcasm became invisible shields. A well-timed eye roll at an in-law's ridiculous demand, or a snide comment muttered under the breath while kneading bread, allowed women to maintain a sense of self amid constant evaluation. Marriage also demanded navigating male ego gymnastics with precision, as husbands were culturally permitted minor tyrannies, from criticizing culinary choices to publicly bragging about hunting exploits, which women were expected to admire without showing resentment. Education, where it existed, was a tool for social leverage. Letters could be written in Latin or French. Gifts could be bartered cleverly, and knowledge of local law occasionally allowed women to assert themselves in disputes, though any overt independence risked being labeled a shrew, a medieval insult with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Meanwhile, childbirth was a looming event, often terrifying and deadly. Women had to endure months of preparation, supervised labor, and recovery under the watchful eyes of midwives, and sometimes the entire extended family. Survival was less a given and more a statistical gamble, and humor again proved essential, whether laughing at a husband's cluelessness, a baby's chaotic birth, or the endless parade of pests infesting the household. Even after surviving labor, women often had to resume domestic and economic duties almost immediately, because life did not pause for postpartum recovery, nor did social expectations allow for genuine weakness. These pressures created an intricate balance of resilience and performative grace, forcing women to become multitasking ninjas before the term was even invented. In effect, a wife's success was measured not just by her ability to manage a home, produce heirs, or maintain social decorum, but by how convincingly she could hide her exhaustion while subtly asserting her influence over matters large and small. Observers of these marriages often noted that behind the carefully constructed veil of obedience, women wielded quiet power, manipulating alliances, influencing decisions, and occasionally steering the household's fate with an eyebrow raise or a perfectly placed sigh. Life as a wife in the 1500s was a complicated blend of theatrical performance, domestic strategy, and survival skill, a daily exercise in balancing external expectations with private ambitions, all while silently judging everyone else's ridiculous mistakes along the way. Men, of course, had their own brand of pressure, and it was just as performative, but with a slightly different flavor of absurdity, because being a husband in 1500s Europe involved a lot of posturing, less actual skill, and an open invitation for public judgment whenever one tried to assert authority. Noblemen were expected to maintain estates, keep retainers in line, demonstrate prowess in combat, and somehow appear benevolent while simultaneously enforcing draconian rules on their household. A balancing act comparable to juggling flaming torches while riding a horse, blindfolded, and dodging relatives who secretly wished you'd fall off. Hunting trips, feasts, and tournaments served not merely as leisure, but as a continuous audition for competence and virility, because every neighbor, visiting lord, and priest had a vested interest in evaluating how well a man could manage resources, heirs, and his temper without succumbing to public humiliation. Peasant men were no better off in terms of dignity. Farming, tending animals, performing hard labor, and protecting the household from environmental threats left little room for personal expression, and any misstep, forgetting a payment, failing to repair a fence, or getting drunk at the wrong festival, could spark gossip that lingered for months. Masculinity was defined not by kindness or wisdom, but by endurance, resourcefulness, and a socially acceptable level of aggression. Expressing vulnerability was practically illegal, unless it was theatrically performed at weddings or funerals. Even sex had a performance aspect, because expectations about producing heirs and demonstrating interest in one's wife were practically mandated, while genuine emotional connection remained a luxury few could afford to pursue openly. Humor again acted as a survival mechanism. Teasing a servant, mocking a neighbor, or silently judging a cousin's ridiculous hat helped maintain sanity when responsibilities felt endless. Inheritance disputes, especially among nobility, often forced men into convoluted legal battles, threatening not just wealth, but reputation and family honor, which made casual strolls through the village a minefield of whispered judgments. Alliances through marriage sometimes required delicate diplomacy, subtle threats, and occasionally backhanded flattery, because losing a feud could mean financial ruin or outright loss of social standing. Despite the burden, some men found a kind of joy in mastering the complex dance of appearances and obligations, though often this joy was mixed with mild terror at the thought of a failed harvest, a hostile neighbor, or a wife silently plotting revenge for a minor slight. Meanwhile, humor, sarcasm, and judgment served as quiet anchors, allowing men to navigate social landmines without completely losing face, though occasionally someone's ego imploded spectacularly, providing endless fodder for local storytellers. In essence, men's experiences mirrored women's in intensity, but skewed toward public display rather than domestic ingenuity. Success meant projecting competence, control, and masculinity while secretly praying that nothing exploded, literally or figuratively, within the household or wider social circle. Every day was a performance, every interaction a subtle negotiation of power, and survival required the combination of skill, patience, and the willingness to laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all. Dowries, for better or worse, were the awkward currency of medieval romance, turning weddings into a bizarre blend of barter, theater, and subtle warfare over linens and livestock. Families calculated them with an obsessive precision that would make modern accountants weep, listing silver coins, cattle, textiles, and occasionally entire plots of land as if their child's happiness could somehow be weighed in gold bars. Noble households treated dowries like investments, expecting a return in alliances, influence, and occasionally bragging rights at the next village feast, while peasants had smaller scale but equally tense exchanges, where a missing goat or a torn blanket could ignite mild family drama lasting months. The bride's father often took center stage, performing a complex dance of generosity and subtle dominance, smiling while internally calculating whether the groom's family had over or under-delivered, and mentally filing away future grudges to be unleashed in inheritance disputes. Brides themselves had to navigate this ritual with grace, pretending to be enchanted by embroidered linens or new household goods, while secretly judging the craftsmanship, or lack thereof, because pride survived even under the pressure of being auctioned like luxury goods. Clergy, always lurking with solemn nods and disapproving glares, ensured that nothing strayed too far from church law, because apparently divine approval was necessary for the smooth exchange of cows and gowns. Humor occasionally punctuated this tension. A well-timed joke about the size of a dowry or the dubious quality of a horse could release weeks of pent-up stress, though it risked enraging someone who had too much at stake. Even so, the dowry's real power lay in its dual nature. It was both a safety net for the bride, signaling her worth and providing material security, and a weapon in the endless social games played between families, a tangible proof of who had more influence, taste, or sheer stubbornness. Negotiations often involved subtle intimidation, strategic size, and occasionally the tactical use of tears, which could swing a deal without anyone formally acknowledging that human emotion had infiltrated the otherwise cold transactional process. For peasants, dowries were simpler but no less significant. A pig, some chickens, or a well-stitched blanket represented both survival and status, and failing to meet expectations could result in whispered disapproval that carried more weight than any formal penalty. In essence, dowries served as the social currency that lubricated the complicated machinery of marriage, transforming what might have been a purely personal union into a public event layered with economic calculations, political strategy, and, yes, mild psychological warfare. Behind all the ritual and scrutiny, laughter, sarcasm, and minor acts of rebellion, like hiding a less than perfect blanket or smirking at a ridiculous gift, kept the human element alive in an otherwise brutally transactional system, reminding everyone that while money could arrange a marriage, it couldn't quite arrange joy. Ceremonial rituals surrounding marriage were a non-stop parade of symbolism, piety, and, honestly, over-the-top performance art that probably made some participants wonder if anyone had actually read the manual on how to survive your wedding without losing your mind. Churches were the obvious stage, with priests orchestrating elaborate vows, blessings, and ominous warnings about divine judgment, all while the bride and groom tried not to faint, smudge makeup, or sneeze inappropriately. Every gesture mattered. Hand-holding could signal submission or dominance depending on how tightly fingers were laced. Curtsies and bows were not mere politeness, but tactical maneuvers that communicated social awareness and obedience. And the exchange of rings, if affordable, was treated as both a romantic token and a public proof of contractually binding property rights. Music, when available, consisted of harpists or minstrels awkwardly crammed into a corner, often performing the same few pieces that everyone pretended to enjoy, creating an oddly repetitive soundtrack to an event already heavy with tension. Feasts followed, with tables overflowing with roasted meats, pies, bread, and occasionally suspiciously gelatinous dishes that nobody admitted tasted bad, because public opinion mattered more than taste buds. Drunken uncles, squabbling cousins, and overzealous servants added chaos, creating a kind of controlled anarchy that modern event planners would lose sleep over. Guests were not there merely to enjoy themselves. They were auditors, critics, and sometimes passive spies for the family, noting who seemed competent, attractive, or mildly irritating, all to file mental reports useful in the endless calculations of alliances, dowries, and gossip. Superstitions infused the rituals like a stubborn spice. Spilling wine could foretell tragedy. A misplaced shoe meant misfortune, and anyone catching the bouquet might be subject to relentless teasing or feared as a harbinger of bad luck. In villages, the entire community was often involved, attending not just for joy, but because social absence was interpreted as insult or incompetence, and subtle social penalties could linger for years. Despite the overwhelming formalism, participants found small ways to inject personality. Sarcastic quips, whispered under the breath, minor eye rolls disguised as attentive nods, and the occasional smirk when a pompous relative misstepped, which made the proceedings at least bearable. By the end of the day, the rituals had served their dual purpose, officially cementing the marriage in the eyes of the church and society, while simultaneously subjecting the couple and their families to public scrutiny that would echo in gossip for months. Humor, judgment, and tiny acts of rebellion became survival tools, a secret lifeline for anyone caught in the elaborate machinery of tradition and expectation. And yet, for all the pretense and chaos, the ceremonies undeniably impressed upon everyone the gravity of marriage. It was not just a private agreement, but a highly visible, socially monitored contract, one that blended legal obligation, divine oversight, and performative flair into a single, exhausting day of spectacle and anxiety. Childbearing was the unspoken, ever-present shadow hanging over every 1500s marriage, because, let's face it, producing heirs was not optional, it was the entire point, especially for nobles whose titles and lands depended on a biological warranty. Women were expected to conceive quickly, often under the watchful eyes of midwives, family members, and sometimes the local priest, who had a surprisingly strong interest in ensuring that human reproduction proceeded without divine objection. Pregnancy brought with it a whole new layer of ritual, superstition, and unsolicited advice. Eat this, avoid that, pray here, sleep there, and never ever sit with your legs crossed, or you might summon ill fortune, because apparently misfortune loved awkward body positions. Childbirth itself was dangerous, unpredictable, and glorified as both a rite of passage and a social responsibility. The death rate was high enough to keep midwives in business, and the local tavern full of sympathetic gossips whispering about which woman survived, which family's heir was doomed, and who had fainted theatrically at the appropriate moment. Noble women might be surrounded by servants and physicians, though physician often meant someone who had read a single Latin tome and carried a stick, while peasant women relied on midwives, neighbors, and sheer luck. Men were expected to act supportive while also discreetly avoiding panic, though panic was probably inevitable given the spectacle of screaming, bleeding, and ritual prayers that filled the birthing chamber. Heirs were more than just children. They were the financial and political insurance policies of families, which meant that failing to produce one, or losing one to infant mortality, could trigger weeks, sometimes months, of stress, negotiation, and whispered blame. Humor, again, served as a lifeline. Sarcastic remarks about husbands fainting during labor, teasing over baby names, or jokes about the inevitability of accidents kept spirits from collapsing under the sheer existential weight of reproduction. Feeding, clothing, and surviving alongside infants created a relentless cycle, especially in peasant households, where every diaper change doubled as a strategic maneuver to avoid lice, starvation, or public scorn. Superstition dictated everything from which herbs to place in the cradle to which rituals might protect the infant from the devil, death, or nosy neighbors, blending fear with tradition in a cocktail that modern parents would recognize as zero sleep and maximum anxiety. Despite the dangers, the birth of a healthy child was celebrated with exuberant relief, gossip-fueled feasts, and quiet satisfaction that at least the marriage had fulfilled its primary mandate, if nothing else. In essence, childbearing defined the rhythm of married life. It dictated schedules, social standing, and household dynamics, while ensuring that humor, patience, and judgment were essential survival skills for anyone hoping to maintain sanity, social credibility, and, occasionally, a sense of personal identity amid the chaos of expectation, labor, and divine oversight. Inheritance and succession loomed over every marriage like a silent, judgmental spectator, because once children arrived, or even if they didn't, the question of who got what and when became the unofficial, ever-present championship everyone competed in. Noble families obsessed over primogeniture, a fancy word meaning the oldest son got everything, which left younger siblings stewing in envy, resentment, or a creative career in causing minor chaos at family gatherings. Wills, contracts, and ceremonial oaths were carefully drafted, often in Latin or French, to make sure nobody tried to interpret the rules too creatively. Though human nature being what it is, there was always that cousin who tried anyway. For women, inheritance was trickier. Dowries might return if a marriage failed, but land and titles were rarely accessible without a male relative's permission, leaving them to master the fine art of influence through persuasion, charm, or strategically timed size. Peasant marriages had their own inheritance drama, usually revolving around livestock, plots of land, or household tools, and a missing chicken could spark arguments that somehow lasted decades in village memory. Humor and subtle manipulation became tools of survival, teasing a brother-in-law about miscounted coins, rolling eyes at an overzealous uncle, or planting small rumors allowed people to negotiate power and preserve sanity without open conflict. Legal disputes were constant. Someone misread a clause, misinterpreted a law, or deliberately miscounted chickens, and suddenly a family feud erupted, often resolved only through carefully staged apologies, feasts, or the quiet disappearance of troublesome parties. Succession crises weren't just financial, they were social theater, gossip fuel, and occasionally blood sport, because property, prestige, and reputation all hinged on these decisions, and failing to navigate them with intelligence and subtlety could leave a family humiliated or destitute. Husbands, wives, and in-laws all engaged in a delicate dance, balancing ambition with caution, because pushing too hard could spark rebellion, while doing nothing risked losing everything. Even minor victories, a successful negotiation of dowry terms, the subtle placement of a child in a favorable marriage, or the quiet outmaneuvering of an irritating cousin, were celebrated quietly, with sardonic smiles and inside jokes that outsiders would never understand. By the end of the day, inheritance shaped every conversation, every negotiation, and even the casual moments between family members, threading tension, humor, and judgment through the fabric of married life. Every glance, comment, and calculated sigh carried meaning, as families learned that survival, social status, and occasional personal satisfaction were inseparable from the intricate, often absurd machinery of succession. Marriage was never just about two people. It was a living, breathing negotiation of wealth, power, and reputation, a constant game in which wit, patience, and subtle mockery were as necessary as loyalty, obedience, and offspring. Social appearances and reputation were basically the unpaid HR department of every 1500s marriage, silently grading couples on everything from table manners to forehead wrinkling during arguments, because a single misstep could ripple across the village or castle and haunt you for years. Nobles were especially trapped in this theater, walking a tightrope between showing wealth, piety, and taste, while trying not to appear greedy, lazy, or emotionally unstable, a combination easier to say than to pull off when your cousin's hat looked better than yours, or your dinner rolls fell apart under scrutiny. Peasants had similar pressures, just on a smaller scale. Crooked fences, shabby clothing, or a mismanaged pig could earn whispers, pointed glances, and stories that became exaggerated in retelling until you were effectively a cautionary tale for generations. Humor remained a survival mechanism. Wry observations about clumsy guests, ridiculous feasts, or the local gossip's obsession with everything from hairstyles to livestock allowed families to preserve dignity without sparking a full-on social meltdown. Etiquette manuals, where available, dictated proper conduct down to gestures, seating arrangements, and even the acceptable pitch of laughter, yet people still found ways to flout or subtly mock these rules with clever subversion, because nobody was immune to a little personal rebellion when it didn't risk complete ruin. Public perception was often more important than private happiness. A wife might endure a husband's annoying habits while feigning delight at gifts, while a husband might pretend to admire an embroidery he secretly thought looked like a cat being attacked by a broom. Religious observances amplified the stakes. Missing a feast, mispronouncing a prayer, or failing to uphold sacramental norms could spark social disapproval, making piety both a spiritual duty and a public performance. Even mundane moments, sweeping the floor, serving bread, handling livestock, were subtly evaluated, because in small communities or courtly circles, nothing escaped scrutiny. Someone somewhere was always taking mental notes. Gossip was the glue of social structure, wielding both subtle punishment and perverse entertainment, and surviving the scrutiny required a combination of wit, judgment, and the ability to make sarcastic mental commentary without being overheard. Marriage was therefore a constant exercise in optics, maintaining composure, projecting virtue, and carefully selecting battles while keeping a running internal monologue that skewered everyone else's mistakes, because honestly, if you can't laugh at absurdity, what's even the point? Reputation was a living organism, changing with each dinner, each misstep, each social visit, and couples quickly learned that preserving it demanded patience, strategic compromise, and a high tolerance for theatrical absurdity. Every smile, every compliment, every sigh carried weight, meaning marriages existed not just as personal bonds, but as ongoing public spectacles in which survival, influence, and subtle mockery were equally essential tools. In the end, maintaining appearances was both exhausting and oddly exhilarating, a game of social chess played with sarcasm, judgment, and the occasional mental eye roll that ensured at least some sanity survived the relentless public gaze. Conflict and reconciliation were as inevitable as bad plumbing in medieval homes, because marriage in the 1500s was less a blissful partnership and more a continuous exercise in negotiation, endurance, and occasional passive-aggressive theatrics. Arguments could erupt over anything from property boundaries, livestock, or dowry misunderstandings to the utterly subjective realm of personal annoyance, like a husband leaving muddy boots in the kitchen or a wife refusing to smile at an insulting uncle. Noble couples often had more elaborate quarrels, with servants, counselors, and visiting relatives acting as unwitting spectators, escalating minor disagreements into near-public trials that required strategic apology, theatrical humility, and, if necessary, the silent deployment of sarcasm. Peasant marriages were equally combustible, though the stakes were more immediate. Survival, labor distribution, and neighborhood reputation could all hinge on resolving a spat efficiently, lest gossip magnify the tiniest slight into a full-blown feud. Humor and subtle mockery were essential coping mechanisms, quietly noting your spouse's ridiculous gestures, exaggerating a minor offense for comic effect, or creating private jokes helped alleviate tension while avoiding public escalation. Forgiveness was a skill honed under pressure. It often involved strategic concessions, temporary withdrawal, or carefully timed compliments that reminded the other party of their value without admitting full culpability. Religious guidance frequently intervened, offering both a moral framework and a convenient excuse for taking time to cool off, though enforcement was uneven because even priests occasionally rolled their eyes at family dramas that felt like low-budget theater. Extended family added layers of complexity, as in-laws often acted as both mediators and instigators, subtly nudging conflicts into prolonged, amusingly absurd sequences of negotiation, letters, and ceremonial reconciliation rituals. Seasonal labor and household chores complicated these dynamics. Disagreements were rarely isolated to private spaces because daily survival required shared effort in tasks that were exhausting, dangerous, or socially performative. So conflicts often spilled into public spheres, Children, when present, served as both distractions and inadvertent amplifiers, their reactions influencing the tone and outcome of disputes and reminding adults that appearances were always being observed. Despite the tension, conflict, and reconciliation created rhythm and texture in married life, they offered opportunities for subtle strategic maneuvering, the reinforcement of social bonds, and the occasional victorious sarcastic remark for anyone clever enough to survive unscathed. Over time, couples learned that disagreements were not just inevitable, but essential for navigating the tangled web of expectation, duty, and human imperfection. Mastering the art of mild deception, humor, and careful observation became survival strategies as critical as any skill taught in childhood. Marriage, in effect, was a continual performance, balancing authority with diplomacy, seriousness with jest, and emotional restraint with strategic displays, all while silently judging the absurdity of each other's mistakes and the ever-present chaos of extended family, servants, and community. The result was a complex, often messy, yet strangely entertaining dance, where resilience, wit, and sarcasm were indispensable, and where surviving conflict without total social or emotional collapse was considered an understated triumph worthy of quiet celebration. Over the long arc of married life, routines solidified into rhythms that balanced survival, obligation, and occasional bursts of genuine amusement. Because in 1500s Europe, marriage was less a romantic dream and more a full-time management course with unpredictable assignments. Households operated like small kingdoms, with nobles juggling multiple estates, tenants, and retainers, while peasants coordinated crops, livestock, and village obligations, all under the relentless gaze of family, neighbors, and, of course, the local priest, who never missed a chance to sprinkle in guilt with a sermon. Humor remained an invisible lifeline, a sarcastic quip about burnt bread, a sly comment on a neighbor's ridiculous hat, or an internal monologue mocking a spouse's theatrics helped preserve sanity amid endless responsibilities. Shared labor and mutual dependency created a begrudging partnership that, over years, often evolved into something resembling companionship, though still punctuated with judgment, negotiation, and occasional eye-rolling competitions. Religious and social expectations shaped daily life, dictating not just rituals and celebrations, but also mundane habits: when to eat, how to dress, which chores were prioritized, and the ever-important task of keeping appearances flawless enough that gossip could be redirected elsewhere. Children, inheritance concerns, and the constant threat of disease or famine meant that flexibility and strategic thinking were critical. Couples developed elaborate routines, rules, and signals to maintain household efficiency and emotional survival, often relying on subtle humor and mutual sarcasm to navigate irritations. Ceremonial obligations, like feasts, church attendance, and social visits, continued to punctuate life with stress and performative expectations, reinforcing the reality that marriage was a social contract as much as a personal one, and that every action was observed, judged, and often memorably recorded in village lore or family chronicles. Private joys existed too: shared jokes, quiet companionship, and fleeting moments of intimacy provided relief from relentless duties. But these were usually tucked between labor, negotiation, and the careful management of appearances. As decades passed, couples learned to blend authority, affection, strategy, and wit into a delicate balance, realizing that survival required both adherence to external expectations and the cultivation of private resilience, often expressed through sarcasm, judgment, or small victories that no outsider could fully appreciate. In this environment, marriage was not a single event, but a lifelong performance, an ongoing negotiation of power, social standing, and personal endurance, where laughter, subtle mockery, and shrewd observation proved as essential as domestic skill or reproductive success. By the end of the day, surviving the endless combination of societal scrutiny, family politics, and domestic chaos was itself an achievement, and the lessons learned, patience, strategy, humor, and judgment, were as enduring as any title, dowry, or heir produced along the way. In short, marriage in the 1500s was messy, complicated, and absurdly human, a wild mix of expectation, endurance, and occasional joy that required creativity, wit, and a hefty tolerance for the relentless judgment of everyone around you, and somehow, against all odds, couples made it work. Silk rustled long before love ever entered the picture. In royal courts across continents, the selection of concubines had unfolded less like romance and more like an extremely tense job interview, except the employer technically owned the country. Young women had been gathered from noble families, border regions, allied states, sometimes even from villages that barely knew what a palace looked like. They had been inspected for health, posture, family background, and that elusive thing officials called virtue, which usually meant obedience wrapped in pleasant silence. In imperial China, scribes had recorded heights and complexions as if drafting an inventory list. In the Ottoman world, talent scouts had quietly assessed potential within the empire's vast territories. It had all been very organized, very bureaucratic, and faintly absurd, because destiny apparently depended on how gracefully someone poured tea. Families had treated the process as both terrifying and prestigious. A daughter chosen meant influence, security, maybe protection from political storms. A daughter rejected returned home carrying unspoken humiliation, as though she had failed an exam no one had explained. The girls themselves had rarely controlled the narrative. Many had been teenagers, coached on etiquette, trained to lower their eyes just enough to signal modesty, but not boredom. They had memorized poems, dance steps, musical pieces. They had learned how to walk without making noise, how to speak without revealing opinions, how to exist as a polished possibility. And beneath the silk layers and carefully braided hair, nerves had hummed constantly. The palace gates, once crossed, had rarely reopened for casual exits. Inside awaited hierarchy so intricate it felt algorithmic. Senior consorts outranked newcomers, favorites outranked everyone, mothers of sons outranked the merely beautiful. The entire structure had revolved around proximity to a single man whose schedule dictated emotional weather patterns. If he had been pleased, fortunes rose. If he had been distracted, weeks of preparation dissolved into nothing. It had been capitalism, but make it imperial. Training did not end after selection, it intensified. Older attendants had instructed newcomers on survival tactics disguised as etiquette lessons. Smile, but not too brightly. Be talented, but never threatening. Form alliances, but trust no one fully. The palace had not been a fairy tale. It had been a chessboard with human pieces, yet for some, the gamble had glittered with possibility. A concubine could become mother to an heir, could influence policy through whispers, could elevate her entire lineage. That faint chance had powered compliance. So silk had shimmered, incense had burned, and processions had moved forward with solemn grandeur. Behind the spectacle, however, stood a quieter truth. These young women had stepped into lives carefully choreographed by others, hoping to carve out agency within rules that had not been designed for them at all. Once selected, they had entered a world where beauty functioned less as ornament and more as currency, and the exchange rate fluctuated hourly. Palace politics had not announced itself loudly. It had unfolded in compliments that sounded supportive and glances that absolutely were not. Senior consorts had mastered the art of appearing serene while quietly calculating everyone's weaknesses. a misplaced joke, an overheard complaint, a rumor about favoritism. Each detail had traveled faster than official decrees. In many courts, rank had been codified into dizzying tiers. Titles differed by region, yet the emotional math remained identical. Proximity equaled power. In Ming and Qing China, elaborate hierarchies had determined who could wear which colors, who could host certain rituals, who could approach the emperor without formal summons. In the Ottoman palace, the harem had operated with its own internal bureaucracy, overseen by the formidable Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, whose approval had mattered more than flattery ever could. So yes, there had been velvet cushions and fountains, but also surveillance, before surveillance was cool. Concubines had woken each morning aware that someone was assessing them, maids reporting to superiors, eunuchs managing schedules, rivals noting tiny missteps. It had been exhausting, like living inside a group chat that never muted. Alliances formed out of necessity. Two newcomers might bond over shared dialects, promising loyalty, only to discover that affection bent under ambition. Others had aligned themselves with powerful mothers or senior wives, trading information for protection. Backstabbing did not always involve dramatic confrontations. More often it arrived as strategic silence. If a rival fell ill, no one rushed too quickly with help. If the emperor's attention shifted, congratulations sounded slightly too sweet. And then there was the central tension, producing a son. Daughters brought affection, sometimes status, but sons brought leverage. Pregnancy transformed a concubine overnight from decorative presence to political asset. Suddenly, her apartments improved, her meals refined, her security tightened, rivals recalibrated. The stakes intensified because succession determined the future of the realm. It was not petty jealousy, it was statecraft wrapped in eyeliner. Yet moments of genuine companionship had existed, surprisingly tender. Shared embroidery sessions, late-night storytelling, collective frustration over rigid rules, these small pockets of solidarity had softened the sharp edges. Some women had found comfort in music rooms or gardens, carving out emotional breathing space within marble walls. Still, no one forgot the underlying reality. Favor could evaporate. An emperor's boredom, a whisper of scandal, a new arrival younger and fresher, any of these could shift the internal climate. The palace thrived on uncertainty, and through it all, concubines had balanced grace with strategy, understanding that survival depended less on romance and more on reading the room before the room read them first. Within the vast courtyards of the Forbidden City, routine had reigned with almost mathematical precision, as though emotion itself had been scheduled between ceremonial drums. Under emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties, thousands of women had lived inside crimson walls, though only a small fraction had ever seen the Son of Heaven up close. The rest had inhabited a layered universe of ranks: noble consort, concubine, attendant, titles that sounded poetic yet functioned like bureaucratic job descriptions. Every movement had been regulated: who bowed first, who sat on which cushion, who wore yellow embroidery reserved for imperial blood. These details were not trivial, they were oxygen. Eunuchs had managed the corridors with quiet efficiency, acting as intermediaries between the emperor and the women whose lives orbited him. They had carried messages, monitored behavior, and sometimes shaped destinies by choosing which names reached imperial ears. It was a reminder that power did not always roar. Sometimes it shuffled softly in felt shoes. Nights had been especially choreographed. Historical records described lacquered tablets bearing the names of eligible concubines. The emperor had selected one, and attendants had escorted her through candlelit halls in ritualized fashion. Romance, if it appeared at all, had done so within layers of protocol. even intimacy had been documented. Court officials recorded visits to track potential heirs because succession anxiety never truly slept. A concubine who bore a son might wake to new apartments and heightened security. Her relatives suddenly showered with promotions. She also might wake to suspicion because motherhood elevated her into the dangerous sphere of politics. The emperor's favor could insulate her, but it could not silence rivals. Some women had devoted themselves to scholarship or art, cultivating reputations for refinement rather than seduction. Others had studied the personalities of senior consorts, adjusting their behavior like careful actors reading a script. There were whispered stories of poisonings, of alliances forged through shared regional origins, of tears shed behind silk screens. Yet alongside tension existed monotony, days filled with ritual greetings, embroidery projects, rehearsed smiles. The Forbidden City was grand, yes, but also claustrophobic, a gilded ecosystem where seasons changed beyond the walls, while the women measured time in promotions and pregnancies. Aging within this structure felt especially precarious. A young entrant might sparkle briefly, then fade as newer candidates arrived through the Meridian Gate. Still, a few had transcended the pattern. Empresses and favored consorts had influenced policy, patronized temples, even advised emperors in private conversations rarely recorded. Their voices slipped into history indirectly, embedded in edicts or charitable foundations. So behind the sweeping roofs and dragon motifs, concubines had navigated a paradox. Immense visibility paired with startling invisibility, their lives both meticulously archived and emotionally unheard. In the Ottoman Empire, the word harem had floated through European imaginations like a perfume advertisement, all silk veils and languid poses, but inside Topkapi Palace it had operated more like a disciplined institution with velvet curtains. The imperial harem housed hundreds of women at its height, most of them enslaved or tribute girls drawn from across the empire's vast territories, Circassian, Greek, Balkan, sometimes African. They had been converted to Islam, educated in language, music, etiquette, and courtly survival. The goal was not merely beauty, it was refinement packaged as loyalty. At the center stood the Valid Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, whose authority had radiated through corridors thicker than gossip. She had assigned apartments, supervised training, and occasionally steered state affairs with strategic calm. The sultan himself rarely wandered casually through the women's quarters. Encounters were arranged with ritual care. A promising girl, now termed a concubine, might be presented after years of preparation. If she bore a son, she became a mother of a prince, and everything shifted. In earlier centuries, each prince had governed a province, his mother accompanying him as advisor and guardian, effectively managing a miniature court. This practice had empowered certain women dramatically. They had cultivated networks, funded architecture, negotiated marriages. It had also fueled lethal rivalry because succession in the Ottoman world historically tolerated fratricide. A prince's success meant his brother's doom, which meant their mother's despair. Imagine trying to sleep peacefully with that in the background. By the 17th century, the system had changed. Princes were confined within the palace, and their mothers remained in Istanbul, intensifying the harem's political gravity. European observers labeled the era the Sultanate of Women, slightly scandalized that female influence could shape imperial decisions. Women like Hürrem Sultan, consort of Suleiman the Magnificent, had corresponded with foreign rulers and sponsored charitable complexes bearing their names. They were not passive ornaments, they were stakeholders. Yet daily life still included rigid etiquette. Hierarchies determined allowances, clothing fabrics, even the number of servants. Disobedience could result in demotion or exile to the old palace, a quieter residence that functioned like a gilded retirement. Bonds among the women oscillated between sisterhood and suspicion. Shared origins fostered solidarity, but ambition whispered constantly. Music lessons echoed through tiled halls, as did recitations of poetry. Festivals brought bursts of color and laughter, though always under supervision. The harem was neither prison nor paradise. It was a controlled universe, calibrated around dynastic continuity. For some concubines, it offered education and unprecedented proximity to power. For others, it meant a lifetime defined by someone else's bloodline. And through every corridor, the understanding lingered that affection might be real, but politics was always realer. In the Mughal Empire, the zenana had shimmered behind carved marble screens, a world perfumed with attar and threaded with poetry, yet anchored firmly in strategy. Foreign travelers loved to exaggerate its mystery, sketching fantasies of idle luxury, but the women inside had lived structured, purposeful lives. The zenana housed wives, concubines, female relatives, servants, tutors, guards. It was less a romantic hideaway and more an administrative city within palace walls. Under emperors like Akbar and Shah Jahan, the imperial household could number in the thousands. That scale alone demanded order. Senior women supervised finances, arranged marriages, and managed charitable endowments. A concubine entering this sphere did not merely compete for affection. She entered a dense network of alliances tied to clan loyalties and regional politics. Many concubines had arrived as political gifts or war captives, their presence symbolizing submission or alliance. Yet once inside, some had carved out surprising authority. Education mattered. Persian literacy, musical talent, theological knowledge, these were assets. The Mughal court valued aesthetic refinement. A woman skilled in verse or calligraphy could capture attention in ways subtler than spectacle. Still, motherhood remained the ultimate leverage. A son connected her directly to succession drama. The empire did not follow strict primogeniture. Princes battled for the throne, sometimes violently, so every pregnancy carried both hope and dread. A mother might invest years shaping her son's education, cultivating allies among nobles, quietly lobbying on his behalf. It was long-game politics played from behind screens. Daily rhythms blended devotion and display. Women observed prayers, celebrated festivals like Eid with elaborate garments, exchanged gifts during weddings that unfolded with cinematic grandeur. They commissioned gardens and mosques, embedding their names into architecture as subtle signatures of influence. Nur Jahan, consort of Emperor Jahangir, had issued farmans under her own seal, effectively governing when her husband's health faltered. Her authority unsettled some courtiers, proving that visibility could threaten established hierarchies. Yet not every concubine ascended to such heights. Many inhabited middle ranks, comfortable but constrained. They embroidered, supervised kitchens, mentored younger arrivals, listened for news drifting in from the Diwani Khas. Isolation was real. Purdah restricted public movement, though exceptions occurred for pilgrimages or charitable visits. Emotional lives unfolded in private courtyards, where friendships softened ambition's edges. The zenana could nurture deep loyalty among women bound by shared displacement. It could also magnify rivalry when imperial favor shifted unexpectedly. Aging altered trajectories. A once favored concubine might pivot toward spirituality, sponsoring Quran recitations or retreating into quieter quarters. Others reinvented themselves as matriarchs, advising daughters-in-law entering the same intricate maze. Through fragrance, music, and marble latticework, the Mughal zenana revealed a paradox. seclusion did not equal insignificance. Influence traveled through conversation, through maternal authority, through patronage inscribed in stone, subtle yet enduring. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, the court had wrapped itself in Confucian doctrine so tightly that even emotions seemed required to bow. Officially, the queen stood at the summit beside the king, embodying moral virtue and ritual correctness. Beneath her existed a tiered system of royal consorts and concubines, each assigned precise ranks that determined residence, clothing, and ceremonial duties. Everything was documented. The Joseon court adored paperwork. Genealogies were scrutinized before a woman could be selected. Families with questionable reputations were quietly dismissed. Unlike some empires that drew heavily from conquest, Joseon often chose concubines from yangban or respectable families, turning the process into both honor and risk. A daughter's entry into the palace elevated the household's prestige, yet also tethered its fate to palace politics. Once inside Gyeongbokgung or Changdeokgung, a concubine entered a restrained world. Displays of overt seduction were frowned upon. Confucian ideals emphasized modesty and hierarchy. Still, human nature did not evaporate because philosophers preferred order. Rivalries unfolded through coded etiquette, subtle reports to senior officials, strategic alliances with powerful court ladies. The king's attention functioned as a rare resource. Nights were scheduled, visits recorded, pregnancies monitored with almost clinical interest. Producing a son changed everything. A mother of a prince could gain leverage, though never surpassing the queen in formal rank. Tension simmered when a concubine's son appeared favored for succession. History recorded moments when such dynamics destabilized the realm, triggering factional disputes among scholar officials who aligned themselves with different maternal camps. It was intellectualized competition layered over intimate relationships. Some concubines, like Jang Huibin, rose dramatically and fell just as dramatically, accused of sorcery or manipulation when political tides shifted. Her story revealed how quickly admiration transformed into condemnation once she threatened established norms. Yet beyond headline scandals, daily life moved at a quieter pace. Women studied calligraphy, practiced music, embroidered robes destined for rituals marking lunar festivals. They adhered to strict mourning periods, dietary regulations, and elaborate greeting protocols. Even laughter had volume control. Isolation weighed heavily. The palace restricted movement. News from the outside filtered in through official channels or whispered conversations with visiting relatives. A concubine might spend decades within the same complex of buildings, watching seasons rotate across tiled roofs. Some turned inward, cultivating spiritual discipline through Buddhism, despite state preference for Neo-Confucianism. Others invested emotionally in their children's education, knowing that scholarly success could secure family legacy even if royal ambition faltered. Aging shifted status, but did not erase memory. Senior consorts advised younger women on survival, recounting past intrigues with measured caution. In Joseon, the system aimed to prioritize moral clarity, yet beneath its composed surface pulsed very human desires for affection, recognition, and security. The rules were rigid, the hearts inside them were not. In Europe, the vocabulary shifted, but the pattern felt oddly familiar. Officially, most Christian monarchies rejected polygamy, presenting marriage as sacred and singular. Unofficially, kings kept mistresses with an almost administrative consistency. These women were not labeled concubines in court records, yet their function often mirrored the role: companions, confidants, sometimes political intermediaries. At the court of Louis XIV in France, royal mistresses occupied apartments not far from the queen's. Their presence acknowledged, with a blend of scandal and shrugging acceptance. Titles like Maîtresse en titre institutionalized what theology pretended to ignore. Madame de Montespan, and later Madame de Maintenon, influenced patronage, appointments, even foreign policy conversations conducted in candlelit salons rather than council chambers. England offered similar dramas. Charles II openly adored his mistresses, granting them estates and noble titles, weaving them into aristocratic networks. The public gossiped, pamphleteers sneered, yet everyone understood proximity to the king meant leverage. Unlike in polygamous courts, European mistresses rarely possessed formal rank over queens, but they compensated with charisma and strategic alliances. They hosted gatherings where ambassadors lingered, where artists sought favor, where whispers shaped reputations. Motherhood complicated matters here as well. Illegitimate sons might receive dukedoms, daughters advantageous marriages. Dynastic legitimacy remained crucial, yet affection did not always align with lawful heirs. The tension between public morality and private practice produced a peculiar theater. Sermons condemned excess. Court life indulged it. For the women involved, security hinged entirely on sustained favor. A European king could not easily confine rivals within a harem system. Instead, he rotated attachments, sometimes abruptly. A fallen mistress might retreat to a convent, an arranged marriage, or quiet exile in the countryside. There was no structured hierarchy offering long-term protection once affection cooled. That volatility encouraged calculated behavior. Many cultivated intellectual reputations, sponsoring philosophers or musicians, aligning themselves with cultural movements that outlasted romance. Madame de Pompadour under Louis XV famously supported the arts and influenced diplomatic alliances, her legacy intertwined with porcelain factories and Enlightenment salons. Yet glamour masked vulnerability. Reputation in Europe traveled swiftly through print culture. Satirical engravings caricatured royal favorites, portraying them as manipulative or immoral. Public scrutiny added pressure, absent in more secluded Eastern courts. Still, the underlying reality echoed across continents. Women positioned near sovereign power navigated a landscape where intimacy intersected with governance. They balanced genuine attachment with awareness that affection could evaporate under political strain. Europe liked to imagine itself morally distinct from harems abroad, but functionally the difference was narrower than anyone wished to admit. Titles varied, architecture differed, theology objected loudly, yet the choreography of influence, desire, and risk looked strikingly alike when stripped of decorative language. Time, which had once seemed like an ally when they were 16 and luminous, eventually turned into a quiet auditor. Across courts from Beijing to Istanbul to Versailles, aging altered the arithmetic of desirability. A concubine who had once been escorted through lantern-lit corridors with ceremonial anticipation might find visits growing infrequent, then ceremonial, then politely non-existent. Youth had been the unspoken currency. Maturity required reinvention. Some women managed that transition with startling finesse. Mothers of reigning heirs evolved into queen mothers or dowagers, wielding authority that outlasted fleeting romance. In China, an empress dowager could effectively govern behind silk screens, her earlier vulnerability transformed into institutional command. In the Ottoman world, the Valid Sultan often reached peak influence only after her son ascended the throne, proving that patience sometimes paid imperial dividends. Others, however, did not possess sons positioned for greatness. Their later years unfolded more quietly. Retirement residences existed in many systems: the Old Palace in Istanbul, separate compounds in the Forbidden City, convents or country estates in Europe. These spaces were not necessarily bleak, but they marked a shift from central narrative to footnote. Some former favorites embraced religion, funding temples, mosques, or churches, perhaps seeking spiritual clarity after decades of strategic living. Others focused on philanthropy, supporting schools, hospitals, or artistic workshops. Patronage offered a new kind of relevance untethered from a ruler's gaze. Memory played strange tricks. A woman once envied might later be remembered only as a rumor in court chronicles, her complexities flattened into moral lessons about ambition or virtue. Historians often recorded them in relation to men, whose mother, whose favorite, whose scandal, rarely as architects of their own survival. Yet archival fragments suggested richer interior lives, letters expressing homesickness, petitions defending sons, poetry hinting at loneliness masked by ceremony. Even in systems designed to contain them, concubines carved micro-kingdoms of influence through mentorship and maternal networks. They trained younger entrants, passing along survival wisdom like heirloom jewelry: trust carefully, speak strategically, observe everything. The palace never stopped being political, but experience softened its sharpest edges. Eventually, death equalized hierarchies. Funeral rites varied by culture and rank, yet they closed the same chapter. Some were interred in grand mausoleums beside emperors. Others rested in modest graves far from public memory. The spectacle that had once defined their daily existence faded into stone inscriptions and archived decrees. And still, their impact lingered in architectural patronage, in bloodlines that shaped succession, in policies influenced during quiet conversations historians barely traced. The lives of concubines were never simple tales of luxury or captivity. They were studies in adaptation, constrained agency, calculated affection. Silk and sorrow coexisted. So did ambition and tenderness. Behind every gilded door stood a woman navigating rules she had not written, yet learning, somehow, to leave fingerprints on history anyway.